All right, welcome back to another episode of the 9 Point Day podcast. This episode it's going to be a doozy. There is a lot to cover. We are going all the way back to the start of the games, all the way to where we are going to be now in present day Highland Games, specifically Highland Games staged in Scotland. There's been a concern over the past few years as to what the future holds for the Highland Games. Because if you're not growing, you're dying. But I have two very special guests. The first return guest, we have Brother Josh, and we have Jerry Reynolds. Together, we've been communicating back and forth for the past few months, trying to get this organized because there's a lot to cover. There's a lot of things we're going to be getting into. But first, I want to throw it to Josh to kind of give us an idea of how we got to this point, how we all got in touch with Jerry here. Josh, take it away.
Yeah, well, again, first off, congrats on the birth of the new one. Over to you, Jake.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And, yeah, man. Hope everyone's going well over there. And what was his name again?
Jacob Andrew Langworthy Jr.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh.
Yeah. See, I wasn't too keen on having a junior, but I started thinking of like all the names and all the boy names. And I just liked my name better, so I was like, let's just do that again. There could be two of us.
Yeah, I'm sure that's how it always happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, congrats, man.
Thank you.
Going back to this, so I think the origin story here is when I went over to the Scottish Parliament last year with the St. Andrews Society of Maine. I went to as athletic director of Maine, but also as the founder director of No Fame Games, and we were invited to go to two meetings. One was more about trade relations and talking about cross pond communications and trade ideas and connecting more Scottish organizations and businesses with the U.S. And then the second meeting was with the cross-party group on St. Andrew's Day. And in that meeting is where I was very fortunate to meet Joe Goldblatt. And I didn't do my homework. I didn't know who I was talking to. I just went in just trying to take in the experience and was really honored that they would even invite us and invite me and to even speak, to talk about what we're doing at No Fame Games, as well as and how that relates to other games that we were managing in 2024. And then after the meeting was over, I had obviously noticed that Joe was not Scottish, and he was from Texas, and we had this kind of magnetic, talk. And he essentially just came up to me, gave me his card, and he said, "Josh, if you ever need anything, just give me a call." And I was like, wow, okay. So I put that in my pocket, and time went on, and then I went back to Scotland for the Rogue Invitational and helping with the heavy events demonstration and competition there in Aberdeen. And in talking to many of the local Scottish athletes, they had said that they were concerned about the state of affairs of Highland Games in Scotland. And that was it was a surprise to me, and I think you could say that for you too, Jacob, that it was sad, and it was not just frustrating, but it was kind of like shocking that the motherland itself is having these issues with the Highland Games, where we see some videos from time to time of just how amazing they are, and obviously the Highland Games numbers in the U.S., particularly post-COVID, have been struggling. But I feel like hopefully we're getting to a place where we can at least sustain. But I don't want to be deluded. And then in talking to the Scottish athletes, I was just kind of shocked. So I essentially went to Joe and said, "Joe, I think I have something that you may be able to help me with, or at least have your advice on, and see if there's something we can do about it." And so I explained the situation. And pretty much immediately, he was like, "I think you need to talk to my friend Jerry." And then we got into our shenanigans with the email chains, and pretty much right away, I was just taken by not just your experience, but your wisdom and how you approach the Highland Games and how you your perspective on everything, and I said, wow, I would love to see Jerry on a podcast talking about this, because I think it could be massively useful, if not just really give a boost, like an intellectual, scholarly boost to why this is important and why we need to talk about this. And so out of the two podcasts, Jacob took the bait right away, and when I asked, and I'm really grateful, Jacob, for you using your platform for this, and I'm really looking forward to this episode. So thank you.
Yeah. So I guess let's throw it to Jerry. Do you have any opening statements before we dig into the meat of this thing?
I'll start by saying that Joe Goldblatt changed my life. So he's a good friend of mine now. I'm blessed as a friend. Joe is the guy who did the first ever academic course on event management. And the thing about events is that everybody organises events. I mean, what we're doing today is an event. Everybody who's watching has events as part of their lives, but Joe studied it, all the many things that are events. And for me, I got involved as an event manager. I had a 40-year career, but the latter half was, the last 20 years was 21 years, up in the Scottish Highlands. So I moved from northeast England, where I live, up to Inverness, and I was never ever going to leave the Highlands. I mean, I love the place. But I got a phone call. My son was going to have, and his wife were going to have my first ever grandchild. So the house was up for sale within 6 days, and I'm back home. Because everything had closed down because of COVID. So I'd had a long period in lockdown. So I'm kind of fortunate in that my retirement wasn't one of these things where I organised an event and got a gold watch or whatever. I actually had a time to adjust to it. And so I'm now retired, and I thought I'd put everything with Highland Games behind me. And then, of course, Joe passes on my details, and suddenly it's been amazing, guys, just thinking about it again, and having a look at it, the problems of Highland Games from a different perspective. And by that I mean, in 2010, 11, I did the world's first ever study of Highland Games committees in Scotland for a master's dissertation. So I spent a year studying the groups. Now, the reason I took a full year was I was doing international event management, and I needed a topic that I was interested in for this big piece of work. But what happened was that I got the chance to take the Inverness Highland Games, or A Games, to the Basque Country. So I delayed submitting my dissertation for a year, which meant that for a whole year I was obsessed about visiting games and doing the first ever questionnaire of games committees, and all the problems that we're now seeing I predicted, and I get no pleasure from that, but the writing was on the wall back in 2011, 2010, 2011 in Scotland. And of course since then we also had the pandemic. But I wouldn't for one moment blame the pandemic for what we're seeing. In terms of the decline of Highland Games stage in Scotland, and I'm sorry guys, but I've always called it the Haggis, Highland Games stage in Scotland. I use an acronym. I want to save the Haggis. And if I talk about the Haggis, it means that Highland Games stage in Scotland, but it also means the podcast is about 4 hours shorter. So, saving the Haggis from now on, right? So the difficulties that we've got in Scotland are that we have a very different structure for volunteers than you do in the US. In the US, your volunteers are, according to this research I've done, younger. You have more of a culture of helping each other than we do in Scotland. And I'm not criticising anybody, I'm just telling the factual things. All the surveys are that our volunteers are retired. The majority of them. Now the thing with retired folk is they retire and expire. And as much as I'd like to delay that, that's the reality. So you're building Highland Games upon an ageing society. So we have a problem in Scotland, and I'll say we because mentally I'm still up there. We have a problem in the United Kingdom in that we are having significant drop-offs, not only in the percentage of people who are volunteering, but the actual numbers of them. We've got a demographic bomb going down. Less people means less volunteers, and that's if you just stand still. So we've had a decline in our population since the 1970s. So you have the baby boomers, then you have the baby boomers who have babies, and then we fall off a cliff. And the reason for that is financial. So one of the biggest problems we've got is we've got smaller families because we've got bigger pressures. So we're starting families later, we're having less children, and the USA is mirroring that. So if we're building on volunteers and there's less people, then you're going to have a problem. Now the additional thing you've also got is that because both our countries have got financial problems, which started in the 1970s with the oil crisis, and then we obviously have the nonsense with the banks, we've got all sorts of recessions going on. These are all putting pressure on our population. We're not getting new volunteers. They're literally just not there. So we think if you think that's bad, the other problem we've got is it's government policy to dump as much as they can into what we call the third sector. So in Scotland, you would have councils used to organise sport and recreation and community centres and breakfast clubs and you name it. They're trying to pass over the problems to the third sector because they've got less money. So there's an economic driver driving us into a place where we don't want to go, if that makes any sense. But it's there, you can actually see it. So as a society, we're not replacing ourselves. So the other problem we've got is that we have to change, we have to find new taxpayers. And we're doing that. Obviously, we're trying to include as many people, get as many people to move into the country as we can. And it's difficult. I mean, we've obviously got all sorts of problems now that we're outside the European Union in terms of movement and what have you. So we're discovering that we built a lot of things on the work of people who are no longer there. And one thing about the whole subject of immigration, which is a wonderful asset to our country, is that when people are moving to a new country to form a new life, they're creating a new world for themselves. And sometimes they're just too busy to go and find out which traditional sports they should go and join the committee of. And then we've got the youth angle, which is, of course, we've never had a generation which has had so much choice of things that they can do, which doesn't involve meeting other people in reality. So in other words, think about the growth of social media, think about the hours that are now no longer accessible for the volunteers force. The kids, if I can use that term, and I'm approaching 70, so I think I can, They've got more pressure in ever before in their heads and in reality. We're living in a very different world. So automatically thinking that Highland Games is going to have volunteers, it's going to have kids interested, and also coming right over the top is we've got the financial problems in that less people want to invest in social community events, so it's harder to raise things. We've got less disposable income because of the financial pressures. So there's a whole list of reasons. It's not just about Highland Games are boring. It's a case of just step back and take a bigger picture. If we haven't got anybody teaching the next generation of heavies, we've got a problem. If there's less heavies next time, then further down the line we've less coaches, less judges, less. If we've got less Highland Games in number, less opportunities to throw, to learn, and also if the whole thing, if the Haggis is contracting, the problem you've got is that getting the media interested isn't going to happen. It's like last I looked, we had 3 world champions for. We had one in the Royal Scottish Highland Games run, an annual one where you can turn up. Then we had my good friend Davy Webster running one, and then we had Francis and the late Ryan running another one. So, we don't even have a world champion. Not that anybody cares outside of our community who our world champion is. They don't care. I've organised David's, I call that the World Championship. I don't have time for the other one. The real World Championship for David, the original. Sorry, Francis. I organised that one in Inverness in 2007. And what we found was that we get more people through the gates if I put on the parachute display or the Red Bull motorbikes than if I've got the World Championships. So the bottom line in terms of, you look at your budget, you look at what draws people in, there's all of that. And then you've got the issue of, if we just don't talk about it, what do we issue? We just give people a list of the winners? Nobody cares, or nobody cares in the general public, and we've got to make them care, which is very, very difficult. I'm fortunate in that I've been to games in the States, Canada, obviously ran one in Pamplona, and I've been around an awful lot of games in Scotland because my long-suffering wife, she knew where we were going at a weekend. Because some people call it theft, I call it research. So, so you go, and I went up to the May Highland Games up in the North Coast, and I actually met the King and Camilla, because I'd been given the travelling kilt. I don't know if you know about that, but Karen Dallimore up in Canada got a little Prince Edward tartan kilt, and she sent it to Highland Games, which had women's events in the early days when women's events weren't popular. So after we'd run the first one, she sent the kilt over to us, so I could put a pin on it and then take the kilt to other games to publicise the travelling women's events, and I'm so glad that women's events are now going from strength to strength up in Inverness. And there's a whole mass of throwers that are there and waiting to participate. Mm-hmm. But So yeah, that's a bit of a rambling intro. I'm sorry.
It's
Off I went.
great. I asked for some
You
opening
and-
statements, and you gave me everything that I wanted. That's perfect.
Yeah. No, I
This
think
is-
what you had said, just to jump into, like, there's a lot. I mean, we got so much to cover.
Yeah.
I definitely do want to circle back to what at some point of what draws people in, and in Jerry's experience of, I mean, obviously for us as throwers, like, the World Championships are a big deal, but to the general layperson, it's like, how do you draw people in? And as an event manager, you have to bring in things that are going to bring people in just for the bottom line. Like, and I got over here, I kind of get reminded of like Blue Angels shows, where the airplane shows, where you have like a month, basically like a Mack truck with, you know, a like jet engine on the back that has like, you know, 20 feet of flames flying out of it. Like those kind of like ridiculous things that aren't even related to the Blue Angels necessarily, but that, you know, that draw attention. And here's the thing, like what you're saying, and in our notes too, of the games are disappearing, and a lot of people don't even realize it. And point in case of like Jacob and I, that I didn't know, and so fascinating stuff.
Oh,
Yeah.
I actually did an air show. I've done 2 with the Red Arrows.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and I managed to close down the main road from Inverness to Aberdeen, because everybody decided that, right, the show's at 12, so we'll all leave at 11, and I had a 7-mile tailback within 10 minutes. I mean, it was as if they'd all set the alarms together. True story, that. And so we stopped charging.
Because that's a
and I had to
one-lane
wait for
road,
them all
right?
in.
Yeah, that's a one-lane road at most points, right?
It's one way both ways. Yeah.
Yes, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So that was fun.
Yeah.
So if you get it right, they will come. If you know, okay, Kevin Costner with that film, you know, if you build it, they will come. Yeah. And you've got to think about, what are we going to build? You see, one of the mistakes that I feel we make is that we will look at an event. I'll look at an event as a 70-year-old bloke. What would I like to see? But I had a system where I would, when I was designing the Inverness Highland Games or one of the other events, is I would say 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to the great unwashed, the teenagers, and then you've got couples, then you've got young families, then you've got grandmas. Segment it down, start thinking, what have I got? And then when you're marketing and promoting it, bring your kids to the bouncy castle, let them have a go at the plastic cabers, but have a section for them. You have to start realizing that we are in a different place now with regard to events. We're now in what Pining Gilmore wrote a paper about, a thing called the experience economy. You don't just go for a coffee anymore, you go for Starbucks or a Costa and a sit down and the atmosphere. You don't just go to a Highland Games to sit back and consume it. You want to experience it. So one of the things we did at Inverness before, the Wait Over the Bar, which is the greatest event in the portfolio, is I would send the 56-pound weight around the arena for an hour. So in other words, everybody sitting there had to pass it on to the neighbours. So you got conversations going, you're getting photographs, you get little thing like that meant that by the time the heavies came back out, they were ready for them. We always had a break in Inverness because our programme was obviously the core events, which is the heavies, the solo piping, the pipe bands, and the Highland dance. Everything else is a nice to do addition, and we had a big track and field programme as well. So the athletics, so when, what we call track and fields athletics, so when they were over, they were doing the relay races. I've got the heavies out having a bite to eat before we bring them back on and crank up the audience again. I think asking the audience to sit and look at a group of heavies for 4 hours, 5 hours, it doesn't work like that. A soccer match, damn, I knew I was going to say that. It's a football match.
Victory,
Gosh,
we have won.
I'm speaking of, I'm so ashamed I'm speaking American. Yeah,
Well,
okay.
so
We give
you mentioned watching the heavies for 4 hours and like
yeah.
breaking up the entertainment, and that's I know here in the States the heavies, like a lot of guys complain about having an overly scheduled day because they want to just run to the next event, and try to get done as quickly as possible.
And go to the beer tent.
Right, and that's
Right.
to get to the beer tent. It's 6 hours, and you got to get through all these steps.
And
But
you've got to get home. Yeah.
but for the show of it, it's you're missing so much for the crowd because you're just watching the same group of guys do the same thing. You get a little numb to what you're seeing, and so breaking it up with the athletics, the light athletics and things like that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I saw your podcast about the core events. And I noticed how everybody put in the events that they loved and would dump the ones that they weren't good at. That was started.
Yeah, that's generally the sentiment.
That's very heavy, that. So for me, the first thing I did was get the Inverness prize money and say we'll have one hammer. And that was for my audience. One hammer, one stone. You know, we don't need to see shot put twice. Braemar, open, heavy, light, it's the same stuff. And when you go to a games and you've watched 36 throws for your audience, it's like, oh, not this again. Here we go, 72 throws an hour of...
Right.
And you go to some games where they don't even mark out where the world record is, where the games field record is. Even little things like that, show them what you're trying to beat. I mean, some games obviously have prizes for if you beat the game's record, but anything that adds a little bit to it. And then, of course, we ran with a dual commentator thing. I did it for a while, but then brought in somebody much better, Graham Allen, and I was able to go back and do my job, which is look after the overview of the whole site. But I felt there was a need to actually get out there and talk. And that's why I just literally grabbed a mic and went out and started telling people what they were saying. And obviously the reaction to that is a lot better. We have to remember that not everybody's an expert. Not everybody's our age. Not everybody's interested in any of the sections. I mean, I attended one games. It was Triad Games down in Carolina, and the pipe bands were like a mile away. And when I was in Calgary, they didn't. The heavy, we don't want the pipers anywhere near us. The whole thing about a Highland Games is, if we're going to be honest about it, is it's a multi-stimulation type thing. You're giving them things to look at. There's the dancers, there's the heavies, there's this. If your field can accommodate that, it's really important. Are you guys aware of the links between the Highland Games and the Olympic Games?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Strathconnell Highland Games did a demo at the Paris exhibition, and Baron de Coubertin saw it, and the light bulb went on. Multiple events simultaneously. It's great
one of
that
the, if I recall, they had caber at the Olympics in 1912. I think it was that one. Like there was a caber toss there.
Wow. They had tug of war.
Yeah.
Which is one of the events I had to get rid of. Because of the damage it was doing to our shinty field. We were ending up with a trench, and I was having to pay 2,000 quid to get the trench repaired in the sports field. And guys hanging off a rope, it was too expensive. Sorry, guys. The other one was grass cycling. I was paying a fortune for a procession. And it was like, hang on, what's this? So one of the things, you do have resistance to change, but if the spectators are telling me they're not enjoying something and my budget's telling me I'm not enjoying them, then you've got to win the argument for making changes. And I'm sorry for everybody who's disappointed, but even just changing your schedule slightly can make it feel different. One of the first things I got told in Inverness was seen one, seen them all. And I took that as a personal challenge.
Right.
And yeah, we tweak things, we invented things. But you've got to be constantly
Let me jump in
aware.
real quick, Jerry, actually.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, as you finish your thought, I think it's important, and we had discussed this too, on what is the Highland Games in Scotland, like what constitutes the Highland Games, and then
I was just about to say that,
it's different.
Yeah.
I think it's different here. And when we say in the U.S. often the Highland Games, it's kind of arrogant in a way to say we're referring to many times the heavy athletics, not necessarily.
It's almost always the heavies that
heavies.
we're talking about. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
please educate us, ungrateful former colonists.
Yeah, because you've mentioned cycling and tug of war and we have pipe band competitions here, but when we do have tug of war, it's more of just like who wants to try it. There's never like teams, pre-established teams and stuff like that.
Just for if we can just go through it, I suppose I think it's a good time to talk about the origins of Highland Games.
Yeah.
I mean, I read a lot of people saying that it was, the 11th century, time of King Malcolm, Braemar, clansmen up the hill having a run, pick the hardest guy. A hill run isn't a Highland Games. It isn't. It's, whatever they got up to is lost in the mists of history. So let's not pretend, let's not make up stuff. We've got, for example, there was a big push in the era of homecoming. Lovely little games down at Ceres. They decided that they would tell the world they were the world's oldest Highland Games because they had a market. They got permission to hold a market. After the Battle of Bannockburn, I've no doubt there was a giant booze up everywhere the survivors went. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they got permission to have a market. It wasn't a Highland Games. It was
that was in 13,
14.
13, 14, yeah.
Now, as an Englishman, I've got to say that obviously the Scots forwards were offside and they should never have won, but the referees were obviously biased. So anyway, quickly moving on.
Good idea.
I had to live on that. Big up English up there that year was quite interesting. Only joking. Really what happens was that we have the Battle of Culloden. We have that civil war, the Jacobites, the Hanoverians. We have the massacre. We've got Scots fighting on both sides, but of course they're never going to admit that. You've got all that going on, and then you have ethnic cleansing at its worst. You've got proscription, the banning of the Gaelic language, that absolute bloodbath afterwards. Inverness suffered badly. They were killing anything that moved. It was a horrible, horrible time. The banning of the Gaelic language, if you ever get the chance in April, on the anniversary of the Battle of Culloden, go up to the cairn at the battlefield and listen to the Gaelic Society of Inverness, the speeches. It's so moving about how a culture was just, wiped out. Within next to no time, of course, we then got the famine that they have in the Highlands. We've got overpopulation. We've got the clearances. Now, the clearances, depending on who you talked to, landowners called it the improvements. They were trying to find a way to make money up there. So obviously we've got the sheep, we've got the Industrial Revolution, and we got boats that brought wood from Canada going back with human beings and being dumped off. It was the cheap trip across, so they're trying to get people out. You're getting notices, you're getting bailiffs throwing people off the land, and away they go. So all this is going on around the 1800s, but in parallel to that, after the defeat of the Highlander, you've then got, within a decade, the British Army recruiting them for the wars that they're fighting. So they had to reinvent a glorious history for the Highlanders, who only 10 minutes earlier they were slaughtering. So it was a very cynical political move. Right, here's these people, the clan chiefs have no longer got weapons, so therefore we'll recruit their men, put them in the army, send them to France, and away they go. So there's a mess of politics going on all around that. And at the same time, within 50 or 60 years though, they started to realise that it was okay to celebrate the culture of the Highlander, because you can't recruit them and then ban their language, you can't recruit them and ban their dress. So then, of course, we're into a different era where we got Sir Walter Scott, who starts creating the myth of the romantic Highlander. And it was a hard life up there, but
before we get into
yeah.
that, I think when I said the date for Sarah's, I think I said 19.
It was 13, 14.
It was 13. I think I was a couple hundred years ahead.
You said 13, 14. Yeah, I think.
Okay, I was sitting there thinking, I'm like, did I say that wrong?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, we got Sir Walter Scott. We got romantic going on. We got the start of tourism, just starting to come up. But the key thing was that in 1822, the King, George IV, was making the first visit north of the border in 167 years. And they very cleverly decided that when he comes up, they were going to place him as the Uber chief. So the king is the chief of chiefs. And it was as cynical or as clever, depending on what you want. So this German-speaking guy appears in Tartan, and the rich landowners, who were no longer clan chiefs of any great importance, to be absolutely honest, they then start picking, I'm going to have this tartan. They literally went to the catalogue. So the tartan that you're proud of, just try and remember that tartans weren't always these brightly coloured things that you now know and love. And around about that,
speaking of tartans, that's one thing that I've learned a little bit about recently, and people are talking about like the hunter tartan, and there's the idea that this is the pattern that they used for hunting, and in reality it was a marketing term. It was just a more subdued color version of whatever tartan that is, and it's just to sell more patterns.
I actually created a tartan, the Inverness Basque tartan, because when we went to the Basque country, I registered one. It's an expensive process, but we did that. So you can go online, you can see the Inverness Basque tartan. But so we got Sir Walter Scott coming up. We got this massive interest in the Highlands through books like Waverley. And now we're getting into the point where the Caledonian societies were reforming, they were having parties. So how does that leap to Highland Games? Well, according to the research in the papers at Stirling Archives, at a little village called St. Filans in Perthshire, which is a part of the huge Drummond estate, they had an event. And the only people who could afford to stage a Highland Games, as we know it, was the rich folks. Let's be honest. It was an event where they dress up in the some of them are dressing up in the costumes of the people that are throwing off their land.
Yeah, like a ball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and St. Fillan's is the first one where we see the core events, the piping, the pipe bands, the heavies, and the dancing. So that's the one. That's kind of like, from then onwards, Highland Games over here were the ones that had those big four, if you like. Now, obviously, there's ceremonies attached to it. So obviously the chieftain of the games would be the host. So that's where you get the tradition. And Inverness, it's the provost, it's the mayor, is the chieftain. And so you have a little bit of ceremony, you have these events, but then the games organisers have got a problem. How do we get people to come? And that's where you get your tug of war, your cycling, your exhibitions. In the States, obviously the clan society reunions are massive. We didn't have that in Inverness until I'd actually been to the States, stole the idea, came back, got a marquee, and invited the clans free of charge to have a tent in our things. And we actually had Scotland's biggest inter-clan gathering in Inverness, just up the road from Culloden, as part of our games. And that was important, to start building up those roots, because what I was trying to do, you see, was to expand the net. And maybe it's when we do the subject about ideas and things, we can talk about that. So the games are forming in the 1800s. Obviously, Queen Victoria gets involved at Braemar, and obviously the games become popular. In the 1830s, 1835, the railway come to Scotland, and then now we got mass tourism. And of course they're advertising the product, and the product is come and see Scotland, come and see the natural beauty, come and see the culture, come and kill as many animals as you want on the hunting and all of that. And that's still going on these big shooting estates. And so they came north, and in a way Scotland was absorbed back into the United Kingdom in terms of the relationship, and that took from Culloden to Queen Victoria. Then suddenly it was the brave Highlanders, and God love them, fighting in their kilts all the way through. But it's in a way it's obvious, and in a way it's cynical, but in another way it's wonderful that happened. That there was an appreciation developed for Scottish culture. Overseas, do
you think Walter Scott's like romanticizing about the Highlands and like the Scottish culture, do you think Highland Games would have even existed, came about, if he wasn't there kind of like pushing the idea of the big brave Highlander and
promoting
the part? Yeah.
Well, the funny thing is, you see, that gatherings have been going on in Scotland since the first time two cavemen came out and started throwing stones to see who was stronger. It's in our DNA. Community gatherings are different to Highland Games in that we don't need an excuse to party. All through time we've had, obviously we've had the Roman times, but think about all the religious ceremonies and processions. We're coming into Mardi Gras season in New Orleans, which was amazing to see. I visited one of the events I studied. I went to Mardi Gras, see how they did it. I didn't realise the scale of it. I didn't realise it was 80 parades.
Massive.
I learned so much. I'm very fortunate. New Orleans police were great in that I got chatting with them and in the control room, and I saw how they did stuff bit by bit. But the point is that I'm going to a festival next week in Spain, in Cadiz, when we go over to Seville. You know, there are festivals all over the world. These community events, you go down to Australia and they've got the agricultural shows, you've got the agricultural shows in the States. So in answer to your question, there will always be events. There will always be festivals. But what we've got to look at is, where are Highland Games going to sit? One of the things that, certainly when I was in the Carolinas at their games, the very next day there was a Vietnamese community group gathering. And yet you have one group putting their games equipment away, you've got another group putting their equipment out. And as an event manager, I'm going, what's happening? So one of the things I did in Inverness was I was bolting events on. So the first Highland Pride event used our marquee the day after our games. So you've got to, as far as community is concerned, you've got to make friends. You know, at the moment we're in isolation. You know, when we hire a marquee, we pay for the week, and yet we only use it on the Saturday. That is insane. Think about that. What could you do? Could you have a junior games? Could you have a kids games? Could you have something completely nothing to do with the games? You know, how many games marquees are used for somebody's wedding? When I went to the Basque country, they were absolutely masters at it. They had the Highland Games, they had a children's festival, they had an evening concert, and they had a late night disco. And you had different teams move in, took over, move in, took over. That's the level that we should be aiming at. But we're not doing that because we're not sharing ideas as event managers, you know. So what defines our Highland Games? As far as I'm concerned, it's whatever ticks your box. And I'll be cynical about that. You're the customer. Who do we do it for? I mean, the heavies, God love them, think we do it for them.
Yeah.
You know,
Wait,
I was
you don't?
only
Oh my
no,
God.
I was only up there for 21 years. I mean, I'm sure one day they will pick up a chair and help us tidy up the field. But I was only there 21 years. So.
I won't hold my breath on that.
No, some of them are great. I mean, some of them run games as well. I mean,
Yeah.
You know,
So you
many of them
mentioned like early on in the opening that we in America we've got a bit of like a volunteer culture, so it's like easier for us to like acquire volunteers. And I would say, like, in terms of like the Highland Games, we don't necessarily have a volunteer culture. We have an element of shame that you're here participating in this. You may not help on this one, but you need to go help on the next one. And if not, like, we're taking note. Like, we know who's contributing or not. So like, if there's ever like an idea of change and like getting people's input, like, it's pretty easy to dismiss people who have never judged, who've never volunteered, who've never cleaned up after like the games are over. And like, it's a little bit of like it's a different culture, but
No, I want to piggyback off of that too, if that's okay, because actually there as I think that in general that yes, there is a culture of that one should volunteer in the U.S. or that one should donate their time. That's I think that does exist, or particularly, you know, at least with me growing up, that's what that was like. But for now, in the new world that we live in, it's not easy to get volunteers, I will say. And I think that a lot of games do have a lot of trouble getting volunteers. And whereas compared to what we would compare to, or at least that I can compare to in the powerlifting community, that if it's kind of like expected that if you compete, then you have so many that you're helping out at, that there is that culture of giving back and volunteering. And I do think, well, in speaking to some of the local Scottish athletes, that many of them who are friends, like Sinclair, patients, that he would say he has difficulty getting volunteers even for his events, for kids that are not in the Highland Games, just in general, for sports, for sporting events.
Just last week, High Life Highland were advertising in the newspapers. They put out a press release saying, we need help. But what I was saying earlier about the pressure, the dwindling pool, there's more opportunities. It's very difficult. The other thing that we have over here, of course, is legislation with regard to all sorts of matters. I mean, we've had to clean up our act in the event world by, every health and safety improvement that's been made, I always said was written in blood, right? Somebody got hurt, therefore. Now, obviously, some people have gone way, way over the top with that, and common sense goes out the window, and they claim to ban things because it might happen. And I've had examples of that. Somebody was giving out balloons to children and phoned me at home at 11 o'clock at night. What if the child swallows the balloon when they get home? You know, if you want to look for problems and go to the far end, you will find them. You know, we're in the job of making things happen safely, all right, and common sense does go that, but we're also in an era where people would like to complain, would like to get a dopamine rush by showing a photograph of something wrong on instant media, you know, and that's a horrible thing when it happens to you. You know, if in all innocence something happens. I had an example where I did a Halloween show on Ness Islands, and our local theatre had some ghostly figures hanging in the trees. And somebody alerted us to it. About a month later, nobody had seen it, so we went and removed it. Somebody taken a photograph, phoned the local paper and said, we're mocking the suicidal. And then, of course, it all kicks off. Because, you know, yeah. And that's the kind of thing that you have to deal with. I mean, the vast majority of people are brilliant. If you've got a problem, they'll just tell you, and you'll help them. We had an example, classic, somebody had thrown up in a toilet, mobile toilet, and somebody, rather than tell us so we can clean it, takes a photograph and tweets it. That's the world we live in. So, am I responsible is a question you often get asked. I don't want to get involved because will I be sued if something happens? Right? There is a fear factor there's fear of personal criticism. There's a fear about, can somebody sue me if somebody gets hurt? You know, and that's something that we have to calm people down a bit, which is why, you know, your event plans are always. We're lucky we have things called safety advisory groups, where the police, the ambulance, the fire brigade, the stewards, and yourselves, we all meet before an event, and we go over it because you need more than one perspective. I don't know if you have that system of licensing over there. Do you have to apply to the city for not just a license to use their land, but also for what you're going to do? Do you have to show them what you're planning?
Yeah.
Generally. Generally based on what state you're in, usually everyone has some kind of like, like if you are running a bunch of traffic on a certain road, like you have to get a permit for that.
I wanted to jump in too, like then, so for the Highland Games then, you know, with running the event and all of the liability that goes into that, which I know very personally, with that, so you had mentioned before in Highland Games, what you categorize as a Highland Games of whatever it ticks, whatever you think, you know, will tick the box. But like going back even to like 1818 or some historical texts or what you found, is you had mentioned heavies, solo piping, and Highland dance. And is that what constitutes a Highland Games, or is there, what is your feel, or your experience and research say about that?
Basically, if one of the elements, the pipe bands, if you don't have a pipe band, you don't have a Highland dance, you don't have solo piping, and you don't have the heavies, your customer is going to feel shortchanged. So the one thing that we've got as a community is that with regards to a Highland Games, if you put the word Highland Games, I'm running a Highland Games, there's an expectation that's what you're going to provide. Now you can argue for some people the Highland Games is the throwing events. And that's fine, they can do that, but if somebody in Scotland attended one and an element was missing, they would complain because it would feel incomplete. So then you're into the realms of people's expectations. Again, we've got to remember that when somebody buys a ticket to attend the games, they've got an idea about what they're buying. Yeah? So you've got to meet that event. You've got to meet that expectation, but we've also got to exceed their expectations. And that's where the magic happens. So, for example, one of the things I invented, and I literally invented it on the fly, standing there with a microphone, was the Mass Highland Fling. Because I had a line of 40 dancers, and I saw the mothers dancing in the crowd, and I said, you know what? Let's get them out. Anybody want to dance? Go in the second row, get behind them. And then the tourists were out, I forgot the name of the American program, but I had an American TV star filming at the event. Expedition Unknown, I think it's called. Yeah. And he was dancing. We had a drone above the crowd, and we had an Italian TV crew doing the same thing at the other end. It was a lot of fun with that. So even just getting our heavies out to warm up by dancing, just come out, guys, just have some fun, engage with the crowd, let them be part of the show, let them get their photographs. It's a great way to start. So, little idea, silly idea.
No, I think Jacob's taking notes. So.
Yeah, I'm always taking notes. My computer's lined with sticky notes.
Yeah. Well, one of the things is, you see, that as a community, sharing tips with each other, we're not very good at it. Now, in the event world, in the academic world, the event people are saying the academics don't tell them what's happening, and the academics, goes the other way, so you've got this blockage with knowledge. I mean, when was the last time anybody rang either of you up and said, what went wrong at your event? What can I learn from? You see, the other thing is we don't learn from each other's mistakes. We live in an industry where everybody hides their mistakes. The two best people at hiding mistakes are surgeons and event managers. Right? So many event managers are the ones who are freelance. You live in a world of success. If you get money from a politician and you screw up, the feedback is unbelievable. I mean, the damage that was done to Highland Games in Scotland by the Gathering, Lord Semple, was just unbelievable. There was more negative publicity on that event than... the Scottish government just lost I know Lord Semple. I went down. I actually gave him the World Championships because in 2009, as soon as I heard there was the year of homecoming, I was on to David Webster for the pros, and I was on to Bill Scruggs and Kevin Rogers for the Masters. And my original plan was to have both events in Inverness, the capital of the Highlands, that weekend. And then I heard about the Gathering, and I went to see Lord Semple, and I said, if you're having a Highland Games in Edinburgh, which doesn't have a Highland Games. The nearest one's just down the road. You need to have something prestigious rather than an invitation. So we had a conversation, and I handed over the World Championships.
Wow.
That was a bad one for us. In many ways, I don't know if we've recovered from it. I mean, it put us back years because, you've got Audit Scotland auditing a debacle. Now, the definition of debacle. If you were a visitor who came over to Scotland, took part in the parade, went to the show, saw the Highland Games with the royal guys, ticked all your boxes, you went home, you were ecstatic. However, you cannot separate the bottom line of an event and the use of public funding for whether or not it's a success. Otherwise, event management would be the easiest job in the world rather than one of the most stressful. And it's only stress we allow it to be, and we can talk about that some other time. The point I'm making is if you lose £500,000 or 600,000 quid on a weekend, that isn't a success. You can spin it all you like. That's failure of some kind of, and obviously that's where we're at now. You then try and have a conversation about, will you sponsor a Highland Games, a community Highland Games, and you're not going very far. And the reason for that is, and you may not be aware of it, nobody in the Scottish government is responsible for Highland Games.
Wow.
There's nobody. Because, and this is something I think you should know for when you promote your own games, how many boxes does your games tick for your community? Social, cultural, economic, community spirit, tourism, vendors. Think about all the suppliers. Think about the ripple effect of having a successful event. We do a lousy job of highlighting the impact that we have. There is a thing in Scotland, there was some research done. There is a website called eventimpacts.com, all one word. And what you do is if you put how many attendees and what their average spend is, it'll give you a figure of the true value of your event, because there's a multiplying effect. If I come on a podcast with you, I've already purchased a computer, a camera that obviously makes me look way uglier than I am. You've got all of that going on. You've bought things, you've bought equipment, right? So there is a ripple effect, but we never talk about that. Your t-shirt supplier, for the Masters, when we had 157 competitors, I had to buy, times 3. And that's one of the problems, by the way, with the Masters. I mean, after Inverness, it was the last open door, because I had to go and find equipment. We had to, we had to buy a lot of equipment for one afternoon. The good thing is we were able to use that equipment for some training camps, some women's events. But it's going to be difficult, I think, to find a voluntary group that has got the capability to, in Scotland certainly, to take on an event like that. And I loved that event so much. I mean, it was such a delight. But the other problem that obviously Scotland's got is that government funding is reducing. Less money coming down from London to Scotland. Less money means less support at a local level from all the agencies that previously would support us. So again, that's another.
Can you speak to that more, Jerry, about like the myth of government support and the Scotland's lack of investment in its own traditions? I think that's a really big thing to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. We've got to remember that we are living in a bankrupt country. That's the harsh reality of it. So what you've got is that every penny that is spent by the government is contested. In other words, there's multiple places that money can go, right? Obviously, at the moment, there's a restructuring of finance going on in the USA, and that judgment calls are being made. We're not going to spend the money here, we're going to spend it somewhere else, we're going to stop it here, stop it there. We've been having cuts in Scotland since the financial crisis. Last week, 30 councils in England were given additional funding to prevent them going into bankruptcy. Right. So everything that, if your answer to everything is to cut, eventually you run out of things to cut. So in terms of events, in my own personal experience, up in Inverness, events and festivals, Highland culture, my events was top of the list of one of the first things they got to, look at. The arts officer went, traditional music officer went. We were fortunate in Inverness in that we have a thing called the Inverness Common Good Fund, which is separate to council money. So the council gets a grant from the government, it goes to, London gives money to Scotland, Scotland shares it out, and then the councillors at the local level decide where it's going to be spent. One of the lovely things up in Inverness is that in medieval times, the land that was owned for the common grazing was owned by the people, and the councillors would use that for the benefit of the people of Inverness. So now, of course, there's buildings and there's rental generated by that. So that money can be used, for example, the redevelopment of Inverness Castle, saving Inverness townhouse. There was a big rebuilding work going on, and the Inverness Highland Games got a grant. So our festivals are a little bit safer. In other places, they've just disappeared. Grants have gone. The Highland Games have folded overnight. Because there isn't an opportunity with the low profile of games to get a sponsor to come in and give you a fortune. Glenfiddich do a great job with the heavies, but we're talking year on year on year, and there's so many other places that the marketing people can spend their money. And then the other thing is the marketing age demographic of their decision makers is younger. So they're looking at a different way of getting more bangs from the bucks, as they say. So politically within the Scottish Government, which is your question, when a study was done, they were found that Highland Games are bureaucratically invisible. In other words, is it community, is it culture, is it heritage, is it business? You went to a cross-party meeting for St Andrew's Day, and you can see that there isn't anybody who is the one person. And you need leadership, I think, political leadership, for somebody to stand up and make the argument. We found that Highland Games appeared on many, many agendas, but there wasn't collectively that energy to drive forward the thing. So what they did was, immediately after the banking crash, Scotland decided to play the culture card, which is where you had the year of homecoming. And they obviously decided to create a games out of thin air, stick it in, bring the tourists in for the day. But obviously the locals didn't turn out in anything like the numbers, because it was felt to be a tourist thing, and that's why they didn't get the numbers. And that's another problem that you've got, as a Highland Games, is if your income is going down and your costs are going up, it's inevitable, isn't it? I mean, that's one of the issues. So you can see I had a little bit to worry about when I was doing my dissertation, and that's just my perspective. Obviously, when I went out, and I've got 48, I invited them all to take part. We got 48 in, and then I started crunching the numbers. And so we finished the dissertation, the alarm's going off, contact the Scottish government, nothing. Nothing. And that's it. So that happens. I'm not bitter. I move on, you know. I mean, but the reality is that the alarm was sounding ages ago. What triggered my decision to study the Highland Games was just up the road in Caithness, was the committee packed in when the last committee member reached 75. They had a pact among themselves. It was run by 75-year-olds, and they're tired, and they'd had it. So now, some Highland Games will never go out of business, right? Politically, Braemar will always be there. Thank God for the Gun family up in Halkirk. You know, I mean, those events are really strong, great to see. But you go to other games, and a lot of the games started in the 70s when there was this big decision to try and tap into culture by having Highland Games, and grants went out, so games were started. But then as the grants get withdrawn, you've got community groups who are left with the money problem. So you're building on sand, quicksand. You know, so what was it? Newton's third law of thermodynamics. You turn off the heat and things go cold. I apply that. Yeah, I apply that when you're talking to money. All right. We all know that within the Highland Games community how vital they are, how wonderful they are for us. But what we've got to do is make other people love them. And we need to do that in ways that we haven't discovered yet. But before we can thrive, we've got to survive. And for many games, when I mentioned the Tourist Board and Event Scotland, you know, these agencies that are there to support us. When I ran the Masters World Championships, I went online just to check how much it was being promoted, right? And it's on the eve of my games, it had TBC, to be confirmed by the national agency. What they'd done was they subcontracted out the filling in of the dates.
Yeah.
And apparently they could only upload twice a year. So you couldn't even log on. Somebody had to log on for you, and if you made a decision to have an event late, you weren't even going, thankfully things have got better because of the complaints that have gone in, you know. But if a contractor will only do what they're contracted to do, that's why you guys do way more, you know. It's like, you didn't order this, you know. So so Scottish Government needs to have somebody responsible, and they shouldn't just push it out to an agency. You know, our agencies in Scotland, Event Scotland, the difficulty we have is that they are focused very much on new stuff, and these one-off new events get an astonishing amount of money compared with the annual local community events. And the problem is it's the community events that are the glue towards it for the image. I've seen events, for example, you'll have 24-hour one-off races, which are apparently going to be good for tourism. So you have people come, they film it, and then it's on 4 o'clock in the morning on Eurosport, and people are trying to pretend that's going to inspire people to come to Scotland. It's not. Yeah.
So I've got a question. Yeah. Do you think that the Highland Games in Scotland are more for the Scots or more for tourism? Because
Depends who you ask. I would always argue, because of the way that I approached the Inverness Highland Games, it was for our community. Right. Okay. So as a council, it's a bit different. If I had a community group, I would have this, extended period of organising it with community volunteers. We only met a few times a year, and they did a brilliant job of looking after their sections. So my role was coordinating one and licensing and also designing it, and then they would help deliver it and do a brilliant job. But in terms of what makes the Highland Games a success, every Highland Games, I think, will die if it doesn't have customers through the door. That's an obvious one. What I wanted was to try to get as many people in Inverness talking about the Inverness Highland Games, really because I wanted them to be my marketing force. I needed them to be talking about it. So it was a 12-month promotional thing in that I'm putting out stories and stuff, shareable content. I didn't just want them thinking about the games the week before. I wanted them talking about anticipating it, experiencing it and reviewing it and inviting people up. Nothing worse, with the likes of the gathering. If it had been a huge success, right, they have the event and then it's gone the next year. Mm-hmm. There's no legacy in a here today, gone tomorrow thing. There's none. You can't build off a one-off. The Olympic Games, Sydney, Australia was talking about this boom in tourism they were going to have, then 9/11 happened. And they didn't have a boom in tourism. London sucked in money from all over the United Kingdom for the TV show down in London. The Olympics. I'm not a fan of the Olympics because I think it's an abuse of government funding. It's a TV show, as far as I'm concerned. It was almost never not going to happen until Los Angeles got their hands on it and made it commercial. And they saved the Olympic Games in '84. If it hadn't have been for them, after we had the two boycotts, I think it was '84. Certainly Los Angeles changed the model. That's for sure. Cities aren't bidding for games now. They're not. The World Cup soccer is now in 3 countries. I said soccer again. Stop it. So the world. I get corrupted every time I talk to you guys.
I know. Well, speaking of, place, where does the Royal Scottish Highland Games Association sit with all of this? And going back to the government funding and marketing and promotion, they seem to be, at least as you know, in the U.S., we don't have the governing body. It's the Wild West where we do our own thing, more or less. Obviously, there are some organizations kind of scattered around different regions, but and obviously Canada has more of a governing body, but the motherland, so if there is a need for funds to go through, where does the RSHGA stand in that? And your thoughts and your ideas?
Yeah. Okay. It was founded in the post-war period to solve the only problem that it solved, which was to sort out the fixtures. So you didn't have 20 games during the 6 weeks of the summer holidays. Right? Everybody wanted that weekend. So our games up in Inverness wasn't part of that because there was a massive amateur games, professional games split. And it was horrible. Even after games started paying prize money to heavies, the amateur judges hated and vice versa. It was nasty because, I think they like to bear grudges and stuff like that. So the Scottish Highland Games group was set up to manage their schedule, and then they, because they were the biggest group, they were the ones that were not talking to the person who didn't exist in the Scottish government. So in terms of their influence, come on, where is it? I went to, in 2006, after I'd hosted the Masters in Inverness, I got an invitation to take part in a consultation. And I was blessed in that I was sitting next to David Webster, the late, great David Webster, at this meeting. Now, it was one of those consultations that governments have where they've already worked out what the decision's going to be and where they're going to spend the money. So they had gone in saying, we need the Highland Games to up their social media, Facebook content, like that, get a footprint, but we haven't got any money. I'm not kidding. We predicted that. That's what we ended up with. They had the discussion about all the problems, volunteering, funding, etc., etc. When the report came out, it equated Highland Games in its entirety with grass quoits and backhold wrestling. So think about that. In terms of the image of Highland Games globally, the Scottish Government has commissioned a report, which is still available, it was published in 2007, which said that we were equal to people throwing grass quoits. They were that far off the pace. Their figures were crazy. They were quoting the value of Highland Games at a figure that had been generated by a report from Highlands and Islands Enterprise. What they did was they thought that the average value of an event, it generated X in tourism, X in money. The only thing is, though, that that report hadn't asked a single Highland Games to talk about how many people visited it, right? And I know that for a fact. So government policy is done by a report that wasn't accurate and didn't cover Highland Games. That's how far off the pace they are. Right now, does the Scottish Highland Games Association have any influence? It should be used a bit like the Society of Highland Clans as a way in. I think they're missing, if you combine the clan societies and the two of them together, then you're starting to have a very logical way into drawing people into seeing the events. But I would always say that our focus should be on the locals, because if you turn up with 200 people, wonderful though it is, and if you're to come to Scotland for a fortnight, if you turn up and there's 200 people there, there's no atmosphere, you'll go back, you'll not enjoy it. So to me it's always about building the audience, construct an audience, do whatever it takes to get a buzz, because if you go to an event and there's nobody there, you think badly of it. Think about it, you like the buzz of going to a big crowd, We have a saying, the match was played in front of 3 men and a dog, and that's a football game, when nobody's there. It's a park football. There's no atmosphere. How can you as a games committee make additional money if there's nobody to sell t-shirts to, there's nobody to buy the vendors' food? One of the big problems with vendors is obviously they can be wiped out with the rain, they can be wiped out with a low crowd, they will not pay you a high rental fee if you don't have a good crowd turnout. So if the Highland Games alone isn't enough, you have to think outside the box and have the games as the jewel in the crown, but then see what else you can surround it with. The heavies to me are the stars of the show. and they should be treated like that, but they should also be presented like that. Some Highland Games, I do know, they have like a morning event where the locals get to throw, and then they have an evening event.
So, you're like Highland Games in Scotland are having to compete with like many other sports because you guys have a lot over there. Do you think that that's a challenge to getting attendance at the games and getting volunteers to support it?
Well, Inverness Caledonian Thistle Football Club just went into administration recently because not enough people turned up to support them. And yeah, that's just one example. They play in a league where 2 clubs are currently in administration and have a minus 15 points and more money problems than you know what to do with. So in terms of culture, competing is absolutely the difference between getting on the door after the Titanic sunk and drowning. In other words, Jack is where we're at, and Grace or Rose is up on the door, right? In terms of competition, we're not only competing against other forms of entertainment, but we're competing for time in education in schools. We're competing for changing the lifestyle of people. We're competing on so many fronts. It's unbelievable. It's not just about entertainment. It's about we're competing to persuade parents to come and spend the day with us. We're competing against kids to go and join their athletics club to learn how to throw before they even come near us. Mm-hmm. We don't have Highland Games clubs, anything like that. We just don't have them. And one thing about the athletics club, Inverness Harriers have just appealed because they've got 200 children on the waiting list to join a track and field club. Mm. Now, we have failed massively, politically, parents as everything. If we've got kids who can't do the things that we took for granted, and I can tell you the date when it went wrong. The United Kingdom used to pay paid teachers overtime up until the 1980s. And we had a fantastic programme of after-school classes and sport. The moment that stopped, things died. We've actually still got one athletics record for under 15s from 1985 on the Inverness Highland Games record books. Now, we shouldn't have kids still being the record holders, but it's a sign of the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, so competing with modern entertainment, we're competing for so much more than just football. Music festivals. I mean, there's an oversaturation of music festivals in the UK. Some of them are going down. We don't know what new challenges or new attractions are coming over the horizon. But that's the constant, you know, the constant is that we're always competing. So with Highland Games, there's a traditional heart, and then there's all the wonderful stuff we can do around it. And that's a good point to start to be optimistic, because while I have highlighted all the challenges from my perspective, I must admit I found it difficult to be so negative for so long. But if we don't highlight the problems, then we're never going to fix them. And I hope to be gloriously wrong. I really do. And that's the ambition. We want not to be having this conversation in a decade when we've lost another half. And purely in terms of number, we're at 25% of what we had in the post-war period. All right? And between the millennium and today, we've lost another sizable percentage. And the problem we had was nobody knew why. Well, we do know now, and we've got to do something about it.
Right, and with all this that is pretty negative. Like you've said, there's a positive, and the positive is the fact that there are solutions to fix these things, and that's what we're going to cover in episode 2. All the things that we could do to make it better and solve the problem. Everything from getting younger kids involved into the athletics, into heavy athletics, and revitalizing the volunteer base. But more to come on that in the next episode. Do you guys have anything you want to add before we jump into that?
No.
Okay.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's been good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank
So
you.
stay tuned. Next week that episode will come out. Do the thing, like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you think about this, and let me know what your guys' solutions might be. Look up No Fame Games. Home Games is coming up. Registration is open. Is that correct, Josh?
That is correct. Yep. And tickets are available on Sports Illustrated Tickets.
Yes.
Or SITickets.com.
SITickets.com. Go there, get your tickets to Home Games. It's going to be great. I will be there throwing. So
You better
for
be.
that. I'll be there. Another thing to note, if you guys are looking for equipment, whether it be like belts, knee sleeves, wrist straps, thumb tape, we're talking about Element 26 here. So use Element 26 for your thumb tape because it's the best thumb tape out there. They've done really nice things for me recently, so support them. Tell them I sent you, and that's it. As always, guys, throw far. God bless.